Welcome to episode 2 of Grape Culture.
Today, we're going to talk about how grape culture is intimately entwined with war culture. So, I know a lot of us right now are concerned about the state of the world and the current war. Obviously, when you say war, I think, okay, all right, already beginning. I feel like when we say the word war, it's like, oh, that's consensual. That's honorable. We're at war. But when you say genocide, you're like, oh, whoa, well, genocide means without consent. So no one's committing a genocide. I am genuinely confused how war and genocide are not very deeply entwined. Like, who is consensually going to war as citizens? I get that two nation states can be like, let's go to war, cool, cool, cool. But I do think when we even like the differentiation between war and genocide is already discussing grape culture.
War is not natural, not even like in the animal kingdom. I see a lot of people making arguments about how war has always been a part of this and that, and just look back to the history of indigenous peoples being at war and like making all these arguments to justify, just like, we think that we need to have the police and we need to have the state. We also need to have war. That is part of the programming. None of these things are needed, and they are all an extension of patriarchy and grape culture. Women are not on the front lines killing women and children.
No.
Never
And
have been.
I think when we say war, we confuse war and defending one's quote unquote territory, right? Because war is an act of aggression where you are trying to colonize another place, take its resources, and profit off of that. That is not living with the land. That is not the same thing as being in a territory. Like, let's say, I guess if we're going to go to the animal kingdom and say, oh, different species defend their territory. Sure, they defend their territory, but they're not colonizing other territories. Or are they? Are hyenas colonizing? Maybe we're not biologists enough, but when you said war is not natural, I think what we're saying is the business of war is not natural. Violence is a part of life. Having a relationship to the land that you are sustaining yourself on is a part of, I do think, the animal kingdom and our relationship to the animal kingdom. Like, obviously, if you are sustaining your life from your connection to the land and someone else comes and threatens that, there will be violence. But the business of war is not that. I think that's what we need to understand. The business of war is politics. It's about colonialism, politics, taxation, and being able to make slaves of another group of people. That is not natural. I think that is what you're saying, is like making other communities slaves to your corporate agenda or political agenda or capitalist agenda is not a natural way of organizing or being within the natural kingdom of how we connect to nature.
Yes. The business of war. A throat chakra clearing. That's a very good point. And you sent me something recently about, I think this was during the whole like man versus bear explosion on the internet, about like species not attacking their own species for no good reason.
Yeah.
And like even though grapists aren't always profiting off of those who they grape monetarily, there is always some kind of profit that's happening. Even if it's just centering the genitals and the pleasure in quotation marks and what it is that they're wanting and needing and receiving, like there is an exchange. Commodity is a part of it.
I also want to say, when we look at women's bodies in the current conversation of this current quote unquote war / genocide, right? And we look at how women's bodies have been treated in the history of war. So, for example, I have a couple things to say. there is this whole paradigm of what is your reward for war? Oh, you're going to sacrifice your life, soldier. You're going to be a soldier for this war and you're going to kill other men. But if you win, you not only get to pillage, you also get to grape. And that is literally a reward for the men sacrificing their lives, whether they survive or not. If you're able to survive, your reward for your efforts is to grape the women that you dominated of their tribe or of their group or of their people or of their city. Like the fact that rape is your reward, grape, excuse me, that's very meaningful. That is the woman's body of your enemy is your reward for killing your enemy. I mean, I think we need to just take pause and really digest that.
And is the animal kingdom violent or is it wild? Like, is violence like shame, like suffering? Like, are these programs or are they inherent to the fabric of life? I think they're programs.
Well, grape, I know that dolphins grape because when I made a video once about dolphins, like I got 700 comments like, dolphins are grapists. And yeah, I actually did know that. And I know that monkeys grape. Mammals grape. And there's lots of animals that are graping, by the way. I mean, literally certain species develop alternate vaginas because they're like, oh, I'm going to get the graping one in this vagina. And then I have some but they do have protective mechanisms in their vagina. Like you might have like a tooth or a claw or something. My point is that grape is a part of nature. Violence is a part of nature. But when we're talking about war and we're talking about the business of war, which is what we are discussing, we have to keep untangling the justification and the mental gymnastics that make us flip backwards in order to be like, oh yeah, somehow it's reasonable that children are being killed. Because that is what we're doing when we refuse to kind of unpack that the business of war is ultimately grape culture. And going back to women's bodies, okay? So when the event happened on October 7th, the graping of women was a big part of the narrative and a big part of the story and a big part of the motivation. And when we talk about the graping of those bodies and the graping of those women that happened, and then that being a justification for what has gone down in Palestine, I'm going to argue that the state of Israel does not care about the graping of women because the statistics of how they persecute grapers in Israel is very similar to how they persecute grapers in the United States. These statistics are alarming. The amount of perpetrators that actually go to prison or these trials are actually taken seriously by the justice system. I mean, it is it's like 3%. It's very upsetting. So to say, oh, no, we're going to war because these women were graped, you don't care about the bodies of graped women in your country because if you did, you would not have the statistics of how many women get graped and they never have justice. And the same with the United States. And I think that is a double grape. It's like you're using the atrocity of what happened to these women. And people will argue even that. I mean, I'm not arguing whether or not that happened. Let's not even do that. Let's let that be. Let's just say that happened. Okay? Because I believe women, and even if I don't believe governments, but I do believe women, and I'm not interested in claiming whether or not that happened. I don't even want to unpack it. I'm going to say that it happened because I was told by women that it happened. But what I reject is that is the reason why the nation state of Israel went to war. I don't believe that because they do not care about the bodies of women. And they do not care about the bodies of men because they are actively sacrificing their bodies. And the same for the U.S. military. I am talking more about the U.S. military than anything else because that is what I have the most personal experience with.
Sorry, this needs to come from my literal bowels. So I was raised in the church, and I've always found it very interesting how Christians are so obsessed with Israel and going to the Holy Land and protecting the state of Israel. And That's not ironic. That's not a coincidence. And it's also really interesting when you actually look at the Bible. I know there's like this whole awakening happening right now around people like discovering the Bible and examining it as a sacred text. And most of those people aren't also studying the history of how the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament connected to the religion of Judaism, has been used as an excuse to abuse and grape women and keep them suppressed for centuries. Like, multiple things can be true at the same time. And to censor conversation about the atrocities that religion and specific religious texts that have not only upheld grape culture, but also been used as an excuse. Like, it has continuously been used as the source and the reason why this can keep happening. Sacred text and religion that also has a history of being used as propaganda for long periods of time. Please research the Council of Nicaea and what happened to the Bible at the Council of Nicaea and how it was then used as political propaganda to protect the state, to just see what's happening right now, not only in this country, but in Palestine. And this connection between like conservatives and religion and Jesus and the Bible, and then the protection of the state of Israel, and then the censorship of talking about genocide on the internet and the gaslighting, like, this is grape culture. And it's so interesting that when you start to say something that goes against the censorship guidelines on the internet, you're accused of spreading misinformation, when actually the misinformation is the text that has continued to be commodified for centuries and then used as the excuse to grape women.
And I do think that when we look at what's happening specifically with Israel right now, is the paradigm of a victim becoming a perpetrator. And we see this in Hollywood. We see this all over the place, where somebody who experienced extreme abuse then makes sense of their abuse. They contextualize their abuse by becoming an abuser, because that is the only way for them to understand what happened to them. It's like you are so severely traumatized by an event that happened, and it makes so little sense, and you have so little control, that you then become the person that creates violence, because then that makes sense of the violence that happened to you. It makes it not that bad. It gives you back your control. And I think the confusion that a lot of people feel is like, well, but the state of Israel, from what the cultural rhetoric and understanding is, was because people needed a haven from the Holocaust and the horrible events of that. And so how can these people then in turn do violence? That, I think, is the cultural confusion that we must say is incredibly common when we're dealing with cycles of abuse, when we're dealing with cycles of grape culture, is that you need to make sense of it by being in control of it. So it actually makes a lot of sense that this is happening in a certain sense when you understand how people collectively process trauma. And I think that the exploitation of that trauma that is happening by the agenda of the US government, by the agenda of the Israeli government, this is a different agenda than the agenda of the people who are fighting, who think they are righteous, who believe in the cause. They believe that they're protecting their women or their homeland or their religion. I think we have to separate the agenda of the state and the agenda of the people, and that people are being manipulated by the state because the people are traumatized.
And like, Christianity is not a culture. Judaism is a culture. Christianity is a religion. And I think it's so interesting that Christians are obsessed with protecting the state of Israel. And I know this because I grew up in the church, and this is not something I read on the internet. This is something I heard and I witnessed being said and continue to witness in people who I still am in connection with. from where I grew up, family members, etc., where the protection and the obsession with the state of Israel is not about Jewish people. It's not about the culture of Judaism. They don't even know anything about Judaism. Most of them have never even been to Shabbat or been to temple. Like, it is so narcissistic, and it is so white supremacist, and it is so patriarchal because they are waiting for the second coming of Christ.
Yes.
A man. They are waiting for the second coming of Christ. What indigenous prophecy says is that this second coming was always about a collective Christ consciousness, Christos, translating to light, awakening, that the masses would awaken. And I would argue to say, like, not to be self-important about this time that we're living on planet Earth, but there is a great awakening happening. Like, there is so many people coming to terms with their own trauma, their own programming. I think the internet and the ability to like connect with people across the world and see your story reflected in other people and be in community in that way outside of where people may be limited in their hometowns or where they grew up or where they have to be because of class and money and capitalism. They're now able to transcend that via connecting to people on the internet, and it is creating a large spiritual awakening. But we need to understand that waiting for the second coming of a man is the root of the whole problem in the first place.
Yes. I mean, I made a video about how evangelical Christians are one of the top funders of Israel and have been for a very long time because the evangelical Christians want the Jewish people to return, in quote marks, okay, because Jewish people are from all over the place, but they want them to return to Israel in order to open up the ninth gate. And then you have Christ coming. But P.S., that means that we all burn in hell. That is not because everything's going to be, all the Jewish people are going to be so happy with the second coming of Christ. No, they are not. They're going to burn in hell with the rest of us who do not believe in the second coming of Christ. And also, God is blessed. We all know a guy can only come once before he goes to bed. But I think when, Sarah, you're talking about the Christ consciousness versus what I'm going to say it's an evangelical Christian agenda, which is believing that when Christ comes back, it's not a consciousness shift, rather. It's a
chosen one thing.
It's a chosen one thing. The apocalypse for them is about them. It's not about a collective. And I think where I violently disagree with this thinking is that just from a physical level, if all the people just burned and died that weren't evangelical Christians who believed in the second coming of Christ, the pollution of all those rotting bodies would destroy your heaven on earth, friends. Like, we are all connected. We can't have a mass death without that taking us all down. We are all on this planet. Therefore, for the planet to thrive, we all must thrive. And so the delusion that I guess maybe they're thinking we would all burn in hell in some other realm. I'm not sure. But even if the other realm, our decomposing physical bodies would still be here. The amount of pollution of all those billions of people, I just don't think the earth could sustain that many billions of people dying and decomposing at the same time. So do you get it? Maybe I'm being a little too literal, but what I'm trying to say is even the metaphor is flawed in the physical world. Unless they're thinking like we're all going to just ascend to a different realm, or they're going to ascend to a different realm, in which case ascend away.
What I can tell you from my direct experience,
yes,
they're not critically thinking like this.
Yeah.
To even be able to have this conversation requires you to have had many divestations from the state, patriarchy, religion, church, control, ultimately at the root. You would have had to divested from the addiction to being controlled and also controlling. Controlling. My programming around control came from the church. Yeah, I was sexually abused before that as a child, but before that, I was also baptized in the Catholic Church. And then at some point in my childhood, my mom got really sick and we switched to an evangelical Christian church because then people could put their hands on and you didn't have to go through the priest to get to God. You could just like directly, like give the healing through your hands, whatever. But there was still all of this hierarchy. There was still all of this control. And we talk about this in Grape culture, and we even act out certain moments and vignettes of this playing out in real time, down to the way that we're dressed being policed, the way that we talk being policed. I had a purity ring. I was wearing a purity ring when I was graped by my fucking boyfriend. So the control piece is so deeply embedded. They're not critically thinking about it. They're so addicted to the suffering. And suffering is not necessary for evolution. But when we exist inside of war and grape consciousness, suffering is not only necessary, it is fundamental. It is the consciousness that motivates the perpetuation of the war, of the genocide, of the grape culture, because suffering is natural and normal. War is natural and normal. What if, and this is me kind of going off, but what if, okay, so humans have egos, right? Do animals have egos? I don't know. I'm an animal communicator. I would kind of argue that they're going through an awakening themselves, and animals are developing more of an ego per se in these times. But humans have ego. They have the ability to have this identity and to be, not to say that animals and nature are not and we are nature, whatever. Not to say that animals' relationships are not complex. They are complex in a different way. But the fact that we have egos and the ability to self-identify and be a person and have a name and then relate to each other like that, that does feel like some sort of divine responsibility that we then get to decide what to do with. And I mean, this is not my idea. The Buddhists literally talk about suffering not being needed for evolution, but it is not until we recognize our own suffering and see, even in all of these micro moments, how are we upholding suffering within ourselves? How are we upholding war and genocide consciousness within ourselves? Because if we are all one and we are all connected, then even our own relationship with our inner critic is connected to the war and genocide that's happening. Because we do hold power.
So, I mean, I think the other thing that's tying this back to the plot at hand, which is grape culture and war culture, is that we as citizens are ultimately complicit and consenting to war culture. However, that consent feels coerced. And so is it really consent? What is my responsibility as a citizen of the United States, as a taxpayer, as someone who can vote or not vote, right? So what is our responsibility, and how are we being held down and dominated to support a war effort? And what is our options here, right? So I think the thing that we really have to do, you were touching on it. There's a couple things we have to do, and you touched on it, which is decolonizing our own bodies and looking at the genocidal consciousness within our own bodies, right? So if you can recognize in yourself the war within yourself, the colonizing within the self. I mean, I think the thing that a lot of people have a hard time understanding, right, is that we're at such war with ourselves. That war makes sense. It's actually totally rational and reasonable, because we are just oh yeah, I'm reflecting the chaos of my mind. The war of the voices in my head is just being externalized. The internal war of how much conflict I feel in my emotional self is merely being externalized by the world. And so our own lack of peace in our bodies and in our minds is something we've come to accept. And that is why, like, a meditation or a Buddhist practice or somatic work or anything that's calming the nervous system, that's making you feel less at war with yourself, is actually one of the deepest threats to the status quo, because you recognize it in the self and then you can recognize it in the external world. Moment of silence.
I just feel so much compassion for how many people are taken advantage of. And this term mind programming has become very like clickbait and like has like kind of lost its vigor, but like it is so true. Like, as someone who has studied trauma, the brain, the mind body nervous system connection, you were actually saying this the other day, like how easy it is to imprint like memories, like false memories in someone. And so like there is so much intentionality in terms of what we are fed, what we are given, and then what makes it to the masses and what they then consume and what they then are imprinted with and then what they live from. Like, we are consistently living from our programming. Programming isn't inherently bad, but what are the programs that you are navigating from? Like, this is the point of therapy. This is the point of EMDR. This is the point of brain spotting. All of these things that we can do where we rewire our brain. But in order to even understand that that is an option, in order to then seek the resources to do that work, requires a certain amount of privilege and time and access and resource that so many people do not have access to. And that is what I saw a lot of in the church and in evangelical Christianity. Like, there was a lack of intelligence and original thought that was and continues to be preyed upon. And I was part of that preying upon and perpetration. I was not given language. I was not given words. I was not given options. I was told this is the truth and this is how it is. I did, thank goddess, have my own internal guidance system that constantly was butting up against what I was being fed. But that was just my own like soul agreement. And so many people, I think, don't have access to that, or there's a blockage in the access to that for whatever reason. And then that lack of access continues to be preyed upon. People not thinking for themselves, feeling for themselves. If you're going to think for yourself, you first have to be able to feel.
Yeah, and I think when we can recognize our own programming and when we can have compassion and understanding and curiosity and patience for our own programming, we then can extend that to others. And I think that is why self-reflection is the most crucial first step when we want to really protest war culture, is that we need to self-reflect first. We need to understand how we too have been programmed by war culture, how we too could have it in us to kill or enact violence on an innocent person, because if someone else could do it, so could you. I think the problem is that we look at other people and we're like, look at how bad and awful they are. I would never do that. You don't know what you would or wouldn't do, or what you are or are not capable of with the right program infiltrating your psyche. Because we've all been programmed enough to do something that retrospectively you regret. And the spectrum of that is obviously very extreme. But when we look at other people and we just see that genocidal consciousness in them, then we judge it. We're of the same vibration of the genocidal consciousness when we're just looking at it from a place of judgment. And that's why we have to look truly at our own shadows. We have to look at the darkest parts of ourselves constantly and build love and compassion for that part of the self and recognize, oh, that was part of my programming. That was my defense mechanism. That was something that I learned to do to protect myself as a child, whatever, how it is manifesting. Because when you can do that for yourself, you can do that for others. And so the vibration of people hating Israelis, the vibration vibration of people directing all this negative energy towards these people, I don't think is the answer. That is more war culture. That is more grape culture. That is not compassion. And even if people are doing things I do not and I violently disagree with, it is my duty as a citizen of the earth to try to understand them and to try to feel love for them and to do my best to show them my humanity so they can then connect to their own humanity, because only through the connection of humanity will we treat each other like humans. And so the vibration online where we're just like, you're an asshole, da 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 da, that is the same vibration. That is the grape culture vibration and the war culture vibration that we must deprogram and unpack. And I think that like it is possible to feel compassion and love for someone that is doing horrible things that you want to stop.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like, who do I really need to have compassion for? And I feel like it's wealthy people with privilege and access to all of these healing modalities, all of this information, who actively choose to not, who continue to choose to disassociate and numb and gaslight and not use their privilege and access and resource to cultivate more healing. And when I think of these people and I tune into the compassion that I must conjure for them, I start to realize and understand that I may not have a bunch of money and a bunch of time. I may not be going on a bunch of vacations at this moment in my life and in this now timeline and in this journey. But what I do have is the wealth of my healing and my relationships and my knowledge and my conviction and my values. Like, my wealth is that I deeply, deeply, deeply know myself and like am working on deeply, deeply, radically, revolutionarily loving myself and all beings every single day. And that is a wealth that exists outside of capitalism. And that is the ultimate fuck you to the systems, because that is like that, you know, we say grassroots, but it's like really that like mycelium network of consciousness and connection where like we are constantly making imprints in the quantum field with our thoughts, with our feelings, with how we navigate the world. And so I feel like I'm able to have more compassion for people with privilege and access and time and resource who aren't using those things to help heal themselves in the world, when I understand that I actually have a different kind of wealth. And so how can I actually then flip that around and use my wealth and privilege and status and energy, especially as a white woman, to educate, to share, to be in the conversations where I literally want to rip my hair out of the follicles of my head. And instead of doing that, just be like, okay, thank Goddess that we have the power of breath. And you can take a deep breath and you can disrupt the energy and you can divinely disrupt the thought. And in that moment, in that agency, in that sovereign connection between you and source, you can make a new choice. And it's okay to be frustrated and rageful and irritated. And all of those energies are maybe a part of the cauldron. I mean, that certainly is what motivated me to write Grape Culture with you, to make this podcast with you, to do this work over the last 10 years. Like, that is needed. The self-reflection and all of the energy that comes up, it is all necessary for the alchemy, for the emergence, and for the birth.
And I would take it a step further too with the particular group that you just mentioned, right? Is that we have to ask ourselves constantly, why did I just do this thing? What was my motivation? What was my programming? Or what was my conditioning? Or what was I actually trying to achieve? What was underneath the action? And so what you were just referencing, we have to understand that the people who are turning their backs to this, they're avoiding pain. And that is very reasonable. We all avoid pain. And so if we're going to judge someone who's avoiding pain, no. You avoid pain, I avoid pain. We do this. That is real. What we have to do is encourage people to learn how to process their pain. We have to create containers and space and time and energy and effort and also not shame people for not wanting to face their pain, because that is where I think so many people are just, they're throwing up their hands, they're turning their backs, and they're walking away because the pain is too much to contain, because we don't have a practice of digesting and genuinely processing pain. So if we're going to be a part of the quote unquote solution, it's about creating spaces, right? Which is what you do in your work, but it's also what we have to do in the energy constantly of saying, I understand the desire to want to avoid pain. I do not judge you for your desire to want to avoid pain. However, I want to remind you that in your avoidance of pain, you are actually creating more pain for yourself and others in the long run. The pain is inevitable. The pain will haunt you. The pain will come after you. We cannot outrun pain. Pain is so intimately a part of this human experience. We have a kaleidoscope of emotions that we can experience as human beings, and pain is part of that. And I think that so much of life is wasted running from pain because it is unavoidable. So I think that is kind of like where my head is at when I think about anyone that would come up with this, rhetoric of, oh, well, I don't know enough about this to have an opinion, or I don't know how this affects me, or I'm just not political, or I want to laugh and feel good. And if I learn too much about the earth, it's too painful for me. I mean, we hear this constantly. It's very real. It is too painful for you to hold individually. It is too painful for me to hold individually, for you to hold individually. You are correct. But we all must hold a piece of the pain. If we all collectively put our hands out and hold a small piece of the pain will be held by us all. But by rejecting it and taking your hand away, it's then forcing other people to hold a bigger load, and their backs are breaking.
And this is the sanitizing, this is like the trimmed like lawns, and did you sign all your papers, and did you do all your things, and were you a really good girl or boy or person, and do you deserve, and did you earn, and did you earn that love, that approval, that status. Tony was literally doing a healing on me the other day because my back hurt, and you said to me, you were like, I feel like this healing for you is in allowing yourself to be loved when you're not at your best and when you're not being a good girl. And that hit so deep for me. And I've been doing this work for so long. And that her articulation of one of my core wounds, like I needed the reflection, the community, the relationship in order to mirror and reflect back to me this pain. Tony was also able to do that because of her own curiosity, self-compassion, and state of realization in her own healing journey. And I just want to point to the way that your curiosity about these groups of people who do have privilege and access but are like pain avoidant, your curiosity about that is how you're even able to articulate with compassion what they're going through and what they're doing, which is avoiding pain. And then we look at the connection between class and addiction. And of course, addiction spans class. But how many wealthy people with a whole bunch of privilege and time and energy and resource do you know who are full-blown addicts? Like, let's just look to Hollywood. And addiction at its root is connected to pain avoidance.
Yes. And if we're going to look back at this current conflict with Israel and Palestine, some of the more disturbing, we've seen all sorts of disturbing things, but one thing that I have found disturbing is these videos of these young Israeli girls, and they're always very pretty. And I think, I'm sure there is an angle and an agenda of these videos coming in front of my eyes, okay? But they're very pretty, and they're having conversations with usually Palestinian men, and they're saying, we're happy. We see these children dying and we're happy. Or something happens and it's very violent in Gaza or Rafah and we're happy. It brings us joy. It feels good. And I'm watching these don't know why them being pretty matters, but something about them being like these like, because they look like influencers or
It's
something.
consumable. It's relatable.
Yeah, they're just these pretty girls, and they're just like, I'm happy that this is happening. And it's because I'm trying to get into their heads. It's that they believe that they are protecting their people, and they believe they're protecting their land, and that they believe that this is going to mean that like Israel will thrive. And I am very concerned with that psychology because I actually think the opposite. I'm incredibly concerned for the people of Israel. I'm incredibly concerned for their safety because the amount of anger and rage that is being directed at them globally is not normal. Like as someone who put myself on the internet for a long time, I have nights where I am not sleeping because I have a video that's going viral and so many eyeballs are on me while I'm sleeping. And I don't always know it. It's just like it happens to be going viral. And there I am quantumly entangled with millions of people watching me. And I don't even know it's happening. And then I wake up and then I have the energy of that. I am very concerned of the energy that the Israeli state and the U.S. military are bringing to the citizens and the people of Israel. I am like, I'm not in the paradigm of blaming those people. I refuse because I believe they are programmed and I believe they are believing what they are being told. And we all have done things because we believed what we were told, and everyone can relate to that. So where my heart is breaking because of so much negative energy going towards these people, not to mention the negative events that are happening to the Palestinian people, like not even to mention the violence and the death and the murders and the grapes. But this is grape culture. This is grape culture is we're pointing at the wrong people. We're blaming the wrong people. It's the U.S. military who is orchestrating this whole thing. And maybe there's a puppeteer above the U.S. military. I'm totally open to explore that in another episode where we travel down the grape culture of who's really in power. Oh, that would be a great episode. But this is where I'm at, and this is where I really want to encourage us as a collective, as a community, is for us all to hold the pain so it's not all directed at a group of citizens. It shall be directed at the agenda of the U.S. military, not even the people, the agenda.
Grief, gratitude, and rage all are a part of the spectrum of ecstatic feeling. The point isn't to be comfortable and feel bliss all the time. I acknowledge I'm saying that in a white body with privilege sitting on a couch. And at the same time, we have to be able to touch the ecstatic, wild nature of what it means to be alive. And that's what I mean with like the cut, I don't know why like the cut lawn edges and just like the wearing the pearls to church and like the uniforms and dress code and you do this and this is what's respectable and this is, all of that is fake. It's not respect. It's not reverence. It's not real. It's made up and it is part of an agenda of control. And all of these systems of oppression could not exist. Grape culture could not exist without the deep need for control at every intersection and level of power. Because, there's also ways that I fully acknowledge that I exert control in my life, in my reality, to try to avoid pain and keep things safe. Like, we have to see where we are each doing this. And at the same time, like, the level that we do this at is not the same that the level that the U.S. military and the U.S. government is doing this at across the world, not even just in Palestine.
Oh, I mean, the Congo.
Ukraine.
And all of it. Yeah.
All
and
of
how
it.
we basically, the grape culture of extraction, how we go to different countries and we take their resources without the consent of their people after we colonize. And we are hoarding the resources of others. We are profiting off of the bodies of others war culture is grape culture in the colonizing of resources and people, and how we have an economic, and I say we as a US citizen, an economic stronghold within that context of controlling economies and other cultures. So it is cheaper for people in Mexico to buy shitty American food because the Mexican farmers are forced through capitalism to export their farmed food to the United States. That is grape. That is how we have dominated the world economically. If we were to look at farming and look at land and look at resources and look at minerals and look at how we build the phones, et cetera, all the resources that we take from Africa, all the resources that we're taking from the Congo, of all these Western African countries. I mean, it is all for the benefit of US companies, US run companies, that we take over their land. And when I think about what is our duty as American citizens, it is to hold our companies accountable for graping the land of other people. It is for us to have educated ourselves on the economics of our companies that we support. We need to research the companies that we are giving our money to, and we need to collectively demand for these companies to restructure their profit models. And we have to do the work to end lobbying in Wall Street, because currently these companies own the politicians that are allowing these monopolies, that allow the grape culture to exist in these countries where we are pulling all their resources and taking them from them. This is our country to address these issues, because these are the companies that are on US soil. So I don't think we can say, oh, I'm not political, I don't know about this. Get a computer, get a phone, spend 3 hours researching, form an opinion, and do something. Look at the companies you're supporting and see, do these companies support war? Are these companies a part of the war machine? Investigate. There's so much information for us to learn. We can do it.
We're not the greatest country in the world. We're actually the grapiest country in the world. And I don't know why I'm thinking, I just trust why this is coming in. Like, you approach a garden, you approach a beautiful piece of land. There's all of these flowers, there's beautiful crystals and stones. There is a consciousness that arrives that says, I must take that. I must take it. I must take it home. I must make it mine. That consciousness is the same consciousness as grape culture when it comes to witnessing beauty, beautiful women, and being like, I must make that mine. I must claim that. I must dominate that. I must control that. And as a woman who is in the process of exploring her queerness, what I want to say about consent is that it is so fucking lazy at every single intersection to not ask for consent. And I don't really like the word lazy because I feel like it's wrapped up in capitalism, but it's like the same thing of not
lazy.
Yeah, it's like the same thing as not taking the time to do the research or just opting out of being political. Like that feels so violent to me. It really just requires communication and checking in, and also a vulnerability and tenderness, which does require the touching of pain, of potential rejection. And if you're going to be in a consensual relationship with life, you have to also be prepared for rejection, and then to not try to change that rejection, because that is also, again, then trying to control. Like, we need to be able to accept rejection and accept pain, and also trust that, like, there is a divine redirection that is always happening. The rejection doesn't inherently mean something bad about you, but it does mean that there is something else that wants to circulate into your field to be in relationship. But that is so tender to hold, and I do have compassion where that is the opposite programming that men especially have been fed through the culture and through their programming.
I really like that point about rejection, consent, fear of pain, and how that is connected to the fear of pain of educating yourself or allowing the violence of the US military to enter into your consciousness. I think those things are really connected. I like that parallel because I think that if we, again, had tools of how we process and negotiate and navigated these feelings that we just don't have the emotional intelligence in this current paradigm to genuinely, truly digest. And I think that is why, we kind of, I think, are going to end where we began, is that the self practice of self healing is the beginning step, not to imply that you are going to one day be healed and that's when you go out into the world. That's not how it works. Healing the self happens tangentially with healing the world. I think there is this a little bit like of a new age thing where you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm healing right now, so I don't have the bandwidth to be a part of society. It's like, nah. We heal the self in order to be a part of society. They happen in tandem. That is a tango. We do it together. I don't think it's possible to heal the world without healing yourself. And I do not think it's possible to heal yourself without being a part of healing the energy of the earth. So let's do that dance together. Let's explore our hips in that paradigm.
You have to divest to be able to reinvest. You have to divest to be able to reinvest in yourself, in other people, and in the world. And I actually feel called to offer a little somatic exercise, because people don't even have to see this video to do this for themselves, because we just kind of like really went there.
Yeah, let's end this podcast with your somatic exercise. I love that.
Okay, so if you're watching us, you can just watch this. If you're listening and you're not driving, if you're driving, just pause this and listen later. Cross your hands over your heart, like make a little X on your heart, and then you're going to tap your left hand and then your right hand. And it's going to mirror the way that you felt your mother's heartbeat in the womb. And this came forward actually for me on our first episode too, about how like, not that any of us like deeply desire this, but maybe at the soul level we do. Like, we're going to all have to be mothers to the world and ourselves. We got to remother ourselves and remother the world. And I say mother because we have enough of the father. Like, the father is in every religion. It's time to talk about the mother. That is the rebalancing that we need. And your mother is where you begin forming. So this is a nice little exercise to do if you're feeling like you want to cultivate safety in your body. You need to just come into your own internal little womb space and remember the heartbeat that allowed you to breathe life, even if you have a complicated relationship with your mommy, which I'm pretty sure everyone in the whole entire world does.
Yes, and just a gentle reminder, we all have a mother inside of us. We all have mommy energy, because mommy is an energy, it's a vibration, it's an ethos, it's a philosophy, it's a love language, and everyone can speak mommy. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.
Shout out to all the mommies.